Welcome to Blender add-on development for beginners. In the previous video, we looked at some basic building blocks to draw lines and text as overlays in the 3D view. In this video, we are going to reuse that code and expand it into a full add-on, where people can specify between which objects they want to see lines with distances and can also disable that overlay again. Our add-on starts with importing all the modules we saw in the previous videos that we need to create the drawing building blocks and to register the add-on itself. We also import the class associated with the viewport overlay panel so that we can add to it later. The BL info dictionary should hold no surprises by now. The next part of the code is literally copied from the previous video, so we have a shader for uniformly colored lines and a function to draw lines. And we define a global variable to toggle the visibility of our overlay, and then define our post view handler, that is the one that draws lines between objects. It refers to some global variables that will get filled by an operator we will define later. And if our overlay is active and we have an object in the active variable, we draw lines between that object and the other objects, where we double check that such an object is not the active object itself. Yes, this is overkill because we will make sure elsewhere that this cannot happen, and even if we would draw a line to the same object, we probably would get a point, which is no big deal either, but it also doesn't hurt to check. So yeah, if we indeed want to draw a line, we pass the locations of each of the objects to our drawLine function along with a color and a width. Next is the draw handler that takes care of the text. It uses the same code to show text that we saw in the previous video, and has the same pattern as the line drawing handler. If the overlay is active, it sets all the configuration that is the same for all labels, like font size, color, shadow, etc., and then refers to the same global variables to determine where the label should go. They should be positioned halfway between any two objects, and with this calculated in 3D, we then determine the 2D position as before. The label should show the distance, and because location is a vector, we can simply subtract them and use the length attribute to calculate that distance. We then position it at the desired spot and show this distance with 4 decimal places. The redraw function is also exactly like before. We then go on and define the operator that will be added as a button to the viewport overlay panel, and that will fill those global active and target variables used by the draw handler. First, we define some familiar class variables, and then we define a poll method that verifies we have an active object at all, and that, including the active object itself, we have at least 2 objects. This looks complicated because we need not just look at the selected objects, because it is possible that the active object is not selected itself. So we create a set out of the selected objects, and one that just consists of the active object, and the union of the two will make sure none will be counted twice. We could have done this in all kinds of different ways, but this is really concise. If you want to know more about sets in Python, I'll provide a link in the description. The execute function simply copies the active object to the global active variable and does then the same for the targets variable. It then makes sure to remove the active object from the set of targets, and the difference update method of a set does that without complaining if it tries to remove something that isn't present. You may wonder why we have to copy anything at all to those global variables, because it's all in the context, right? That's true, but we want our distance lines to stay the same, even if we change the selected or active object. So we need some kind of snapshot so our draw handlers can go on, even if things changes after enabling it. The next line sets a custom property called show distances on the current scene object. It will be coupled to the global variable of the same name, and we will discuss the details in a moment. We then call our redraw function so that the draw handler will act immediately after the operator is executed without something needing to change in the 3D view. Next up is the register function. It defines some variables where we will store the draw handlers we will add so that we can remove them later in the unregister function. And then add the post view handler, the one that draws the lines. and the postPixel handler, the one that draws the labels. We then register the operator and we append a function to draw some graphical elements inside the viewport overlay panel. We will find that one in a moment. We also define a custom property on the scene class. Operators are not the only classes that can have properties, and we need to have some way for the users to indicate they want to see an overlay or not. So we need a property, in this case a Boolean property. We define it on the scene and not on the operator itself, because I think it's clearer this way, and it shows that we can have properties on scenes as well. Now remember that our draw handlers refer to a global variable called showDistances and not to this property. So we need some way to update that global variable when the property changes its value. And that is what the function updateShowDistances will do, that we configure here on the property. We have a look at it in a moment, but first we define the overlay options function. We add it to a viewport overlay panel, so self will be that panel, and we can add extra elements to its layout. We define a label first with the text distances and a new row to hold our checkbox and button. In the row we add a checkbox, that is, we refer to the showDistances property of the current scene, the custom property we defined earlier, and then we add the operator that will be drawn as a button. The updateShowDistance function we configured on the showDistances property simply copies the current value of the property to the global variable. The function should always return none, and we make that explicit with a return statement. Although strictly speaking this is not necessary, but explicit is better than implicit. The unregister function is not very exciting. If any draw handler was successfully added, we remove them again. We also remove the changes to the viewport overlay panel and unregister the operator. Then we empty the global variable so that we do not hold any references to objects that would make it impossible to remove them from memory. The final bit of code makes it again possible to test our code without actually installing the add-on. When we inspect the overlay panel, we see it looks as usual, but when we run the script and check again, the checkbox and button are present, but the button is grayed out. That is because we haven't selected any objects, but when we do and click the button, voila, we have some distance lines. And if we click the active one, we can move it and see the distances change. And if we uncheck the checkbox, the distances are hidden. So we have as a working add-on that can add an overlay, but there are a few improvements we can make to improve the user experience, and that is by adding user preferences, which is the topic of the next video. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.